This is a continuation of Russian Sunrise, Chapter 10, on page 89 as my recording cut off. So I'm going to just start up right where we left off, and that was where Dr. Romanov was practicing for the concerto that he was going to play for the Pope at the morning Mass, and his brother just got done waking him up, telling him he had to substitute for the regularly scheduled pianist who had called in sick. Mikhail now learned that she would be the organist for the Haydn Mass, which was scored for organ and orchestra, but she had not been familiar enough with the Rheinberger Concerto, so the two of them would both be featured organists in the same program. Well, maybe Maria would be a bit nervous too, Mikhail mused. Fair is fair. But then he remembered that she had already played for the Pope in Rome for his birthday, and she would not realize the Pope was present today. Not fair. Then suddenly Mikhail experienced an uncharacteristic pain of intense jealousy as he realized that, had this reportedly handsome young prodigy named Mark not been ill today, he would have been alternating places with Maria at the console in the organ loft, while Mikhail spent the entire Mass on the choir risers down below on the main floor. With Mark out sick, Mikhail would have to run back and forth between the choir risers and the organ loft, serving as bass soloist during the sung portions of the Haydn Mass, and as organist for the three movements of the Rheinberger Concerto, which would be performed during prelude, communion, and postlude. It might all seem a bit frantic, Mikhail thought, but today would be the perfect opportunity to show his new young friend Maria that not only could he sing, but he could still play the organ with virtuosity, even if he was ancient. Suddenly, his fear about singing and playing for the Pope was completely erased by his new urge to show off just a bit for Maria. At 9:10, Father Belarus, well known to everyone at the Cova, emerged from the rectory accompanied by the elderly visiting priest, quote, Father Jacob, unquote, who had a full head of curly gray hair and a full gray beard. As they crossed the rectory lawn and entered the church, Father Belarus greeted many parishioners and friends visiting for today's special Mass, but Father Jacob just nodded and smiled. Father Belarus explained to those who asked that Father Jacob, visiting from Europe, spoke little English. But that's the beauty of the Latin Mass, noted one parishioner. No matter where one travels in all the world, it is always just the same. The vernacular really isolates people when they travel. But Latin, the universal language of the Church, unites all nations and tongues in one liturgy. Nicholas realized from the parishioners' enthusiasm how much the Church had profited in those places like the Cova that had taken full advantage of his action nearly a decade ago. It was Nicholas who had freed the old Latin Mass, so that any priest who wanted to could say it without any special permission from anyone. Nicholas' erudite sense of humor had caused him to give the elegant old Tridentine Mass the clever designation extraordinary form, thus relegating the new Mass to the properly descriptive category of ordinary. Together, the two priests, one youthful and one elderly, made their way into a pew about halfway down the nave of the church and took their seats. Others soon filled in their row, and when George and Katerina Peterson arrived, they could not get close to Father Jacob on their way to the choir risers in the back of the church. That was good, thought Father Belarus, for for of all people here today, they would be the most likely to see through Father Jacob's disguise. The Pope was fascinated to note that several rows of pews had been permanently removed from the back of the church, making room for the orchestra of 25 players in front of the 50-voice choir on risers. The rear choir loft could not accommodate that many musicians, but the organist, seated at the console in the choir loft above, could view the conductor through a large mirror. An announcement was made concerning a correction in the program. 2 scheduled soloists had taken ill, and Dr. Mikhail Romanov of Kalamazoo, older brother of Father Romanov, was substituting on very short notice, both on organ for the Rheinberger concerto and as bass soloist for the Mass. The Pope, himself an accomplished musician, understood intuitively what a great feat this would be for Mikhail, if he proved able to perform such demanding works well under the circumstances. Then the first chords of the Rheinberger concerto were struck, and the Pope began to feel his soul transported into the realms of noble order and beautiful dignity. When the final notes of the first movement reverberated through the stone arches, the Pope thanked God for the privilege of being present. By then a dozen altar boys, the 3 associate priests of the parish in traditional vestments with berettas, and several Knights of Columbus in full honor dress and with ceremonial swords drawn, had formed the procession at the rear of the center aisle. Maria Peterson now sat at the organ in the loft, and as the first grand chords of a brief Widor excerpt sounded, a solemn procession began. At the gates of the sanctuary, the knights stood guard while the altar boys and the priests entered the sanctuary to begin the opening prayers of the Mass. As the priests knelt before the high altar steps, the grand organ music ended, and all in the sanctuary knelt before the divine presence in the tabernacle on the altar. Next, the Latin asperges was chanted by the choir, while the priest sprinkled the congregation with holy water. Then, kneeling at the foot of the altar, the priests and the altar boys began the prayers of the Mass in Latin. I will go unto the altar of the Lord, to God who gives joy to my youth. As the ancient, ever-familiar prayers of the old Latin Mass proceeded, orchestra, organ, and chorus filled the church with Haydn's dignified and glorious music, embellishing the beauty of the words with the sweet harmonies hinting of higher beauties in the heavenly realms. Maria was thrilled by the rich bass voice of her new friend Misha. She had also been astounded at his virtuosity on the organ during the prelude, which was the first movement of the Rheinberger concerto. Alternating with him on the organ bench as the program proceeded, seemed to cement a common bond, like 2 adventurers who were sharing a challenge together. She could easily imagine becoming friends with such a man, and maybe making music together on a regular basis. At communion, during the second movement of the Rheinberger organ concerto, the Pope filled up the aisle in his simple black cassock and presented himself on his knees at the altar rail to receive Holy Communion. He felt a renewed hope that liturgy of such dignity would again become commonplace, beginning in the Catholic Church in Russia, once Russia was converted. The Russian Orthodox had never tolerated any modernization of their rite, nor any tinkering with the old Slavonic in which their Mass was prayed. He began to foresee how Russia, source of the spreading of the errors of modernism, would soon become the source of liturgical restoration throughout the world. Please, Jesus, he prayed, keep me strong to do what you are asking. When the Mass had ended, most of the congregation remained in their seats to hear the final, third movement of the Rheinberger organ concerto. Then, when the church was silent, many lingered, on their knees, to make their thanksgiving to God. Father Belaris wanted to spirit Father Jacob out the side door of the church and back to the rectory as soon as possible. But Father Jacob had other ideas. He wanted to go to the reception and greet the musicians and thank them for their fine work. He whispered to Father Belaris not to worry, that he would pretend he only spoke German well, with very broken English. After another 20 minutes, most of the parishioners and guests had gathered in the gymnasium. As soon as a Knight of Columbus announced the official opening of the reception, there ensued an enthusiastic and prolonged applause, with not a few shouts of bravo for all the musicians who had worked so hard to bring today's Mass to fruition. Father Belaris cringed, hoping no one else would notice that as Father Jacob repeatedly shouted, "Bravissimo!" he sounded a lot like Pope Nicholas VI. But not one of the musicians, except for Mikhail, realized that they had thrilled the heart of the Holy Father himself. Father Belaris was nearly in a panic as Father Jacob went down the receiving line of soloists, warmly greeting each one and speaking a few words of praise in broken English. Maria had the uncanny sense that somehow she almost knew this old German priest. When Father Jacob greeted Mikhail, their eyes met and momentarily locked in a bond that only two benevolent monarchs might share. What was it about this Romanov man that he seemed to exude a royal dignity? Mused Pope Nicholas. He seemed as if he were born to be a king. But Mikhail knew exactly what it was about this old German priest with broken English that made him seem to carry himself with the air of a head of state. He was the Pope in disguise. Mikhail had never imagined that he would meet a pope for the first time in his life under such circumstances, where he could not fall on his knees to kiss the fisherman's ring. Perhaps, he hoped, there would be another time and place where proper decorum would be possible. Father Belaris only allowed Father Jacob one glass of champagne. Then he whisked him out of the gymnasium and back to the rectory, where the Pope had much work to do. It was Sunday, and servile labor was not permitted on the Lord's Day. But intellectual work, which tended to ennoble the soul, was permitted. The Pope, former university professor and author of numerous scholarly books, would begin drafting the proclamation that would soon be issued from Rome announcing the consecration of Russia. As Nicholas settled into his comfortable desk chair at a window in his third-floor corner bedroom overlooking the park-like cemetery, he switched on his laptop computer and asked Father Belaris to bring his breakfast and a pot of coffee with cream to his room. After that, he was not to be disturbed except in an emergency, and would probably be writing all afternoon long. If he were able to make sufficient progress on his urgent task, then at 5 o'clock he would like to relax by playing duets with Father Romanov on the two grand pianos in the parlor before supper. Father Belaris was charged with making sure Father Romanov would be prepared with some appropriate music. Meanwhile, back in the gymnasium, Mikhail had cornered George and Katerina Peterson and was inviting them and Maria out to dinner as his guests. All of them were on their second glass of champagne, which fortified Mikhail with more courage than he might otherwise have been able to muster. Defending himself in war zones or against punks in his clinic was easy. He was trained for that. But greeting the parents of a beautiful young woman who had swept him off his feet was quite another. In this, he was in foreign territory, untrained, and, to be blunt, basically scared stiff. Mikhail nervously suggested the coach insignia, a revolving dining room on the 70th floor of the Renaissance Center in downtown Detroit, just a 15-minute drive from the Cova. Perched atop the General Motors World Headquarters, the coach insignia was named for the Fisher body carriage logo that for decades graced the metal floor panels inside the doors of General Motors vehicles. The Petersons were, of course, delighted at the invitation, being anxious to become acquainted with this man about whom their daughter had been talking incessantly. Less than an hour later, the four were seated in a window-side table overlooking the Detroit River and Windsor, Ontario. During the next hour, their table would slowly move around the circle, giving them a gradually shifting view of the entire Detroit metropolitan area. But the Petersons' perspective on their future lives would also be changing during that hour. Mikhail explaining that he had been honored to meet young Maria after her recital in Kalamazoo recently. Being taken with her musicianship, he had invited her for coffee afterwards. In the course of that visit, they had shared the stories of their respective lives and histories, and came to understand that both were Russian royalty. He had mentioned to Maria that his high school name had been Petrov, but that his family had retaken the ancestral Romanov name around the time when he went off to college. He was, in fact, the only living direct descendant of a Russian emperor through an unbroken male line free of morganic marriages. That meant he was arguably the crown prince of Russia, should the monarchy one day be restored. Since he had never considered restoration of the Russian monarchy to be an important possibility, he had not previously been active in the Romanov nobility organization, nor had he attended the annual Romanov balls in New York City. But Maria had encouraged him to go this year. He had therefore inquired, and the Romanov family had extended to him an invitation to attend, and to bring Maria and her parents as his guests. This would be allowed only because all of them were of European royal descent. "We only learned about that recently," said Katerina. "We were so surprised. The thought of attending a ball for royalty was hardly on our minds," affirmed George. "Visiting New York on short notice can be prohibitively expensive. Surprisingly, my brother's friend, Father Harold, became aware of this opportunity for us. I think Father Kirill must have told him, and he has arranged with Don Brown, the retired mayor, wealthy businessman, and philanthropist, to fly us out to New York in his private jet on Friday afternoon. He will let us stay free for 2 nights in the Brown Group's 3-bedroom condominium suite on top of the Waldorf Astoria, the very hotel where the ball will take place on Saturday evening. All we need to do is rent elegant evening attire and practice our ballroom dance steps, especially the waltz." Suddenly, everyone at the table began to see this adventure as a fairy tale royal ball being generously set before them for the taking. The fact that it might set in motion a series of events that would change their lives forever was not foremost on their minds. They were focused on more immediate concerns, like evening gowns and fairy tale ballroom dancing. Maria had no thought that this would be in any way permanently impact. I'll read again. Maria had no thought that this would in any way permanently impact her relationship with her beloved Mark. She assumed he would be thrilled at her opportunity to mingle among Russian royals. Her parents, however, being older and wiser, recognized the possible hand of divine providence in these events. This adventure would provide an important opportunity to carefully assess the character of this admittedly charming older man to whom their beloved daughter was obviously so strongly attracted, even if she hardly admitted that attraction to herself. For Mikhail, it would be another opportunity to get to know Maria and to observe how she interacted with many new people. As the dinner progressed, all of them experienced a growing sense of excitement and anticipation about the New York trip in just 6 days. Maria felt she could hardly wait to tell Mark all about it, and yet she was beginning to realize that, to him, it might not seem very delightful at all. After careful consideration, Mikhail and Kirill had decided it was best not to inform any of the Peterson family about the threat he had received, or of the fact that he and Kirill believed media publicity would be the best protection for all of them against any attack by rogue members of the Romanov family. Meanwhile, back at the rectory, Pope Nicholas's fingers had been flying over the keys of his laptop computer. A proclamation to the bishops and to the world had taken shape in his mind and was now being recorded on the papal laptop hard drive. Pope Nicholas had the draft of his proclamation, including the consecration formula, ready for editing by Father Harold by 5 o'clock Sunday evening. While the editing proceeded, Pope Nicholas unwound by playing classical piano duets with Father Romanov in the Kova Rectory parlor until 7 o'clock. Pope Nicholas then reviewed the final draft with Father Harold, and at 8 o'clock called for his trusted Swiss guard Jacques, who was an expert in ultra-secure communication to and from the Vatican. The text of the proclamation was to be transmitted securely during the night to the Vatican press secretary, who was charged with proclaiming it orally from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica on Monday evening at 8 o'clock Rome time. While it was being read aloud in Latin from the balcony, it was to be simultaneously transmitted electronically to all Catholic diocesan headquarters in the world, and to all major world news outlets, with official Vatican translations into all major languages. The world media would be given just 6 hours advance notice that an important papal announcement was going to be read in St. Peter's Square, so that they would have time to set up their cameras and get some correspondence in place for the initial reporting, but no time for excessive, foolish speculation. In just 1 day, the world would begin to anticipate the formal consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in a ceremony once and for all, finally complying in every detail with the precise request of Our Lady of Fatima. The media firestorm would begin, and the forces of hell would unleash their full fury, knowing that their time was short to avert hell's definition of disaster. A beginning of the restoration of Christendom and all its blessings. And out of that tempest, heaven had promised to inaugurate a new era of world peace. It would bring about a new period of the peace of Christ in the reign of Christ, beginning in Russia. At the suggestion of Father Harold, Nicholas included in his proclamation the words of the prophet Malachi, "Unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings." Malachi chapter 4, verse 2. Nicholas asked Father John Harold to return to Rome as his personal deputy to oversee all the preparations for the consecration ceremony. A special document was drafted, deputizing Father Harold to act on Nicholas's behalf in every way necessary to ensure that the consecration ceremony could take place as ordered. Nicholas knew there would be hundreds of details to be decided, and that he could trust Father Harold better than anyone else to ensure a dignified and impressive ceremony, worthy of the honor due to the Mother of God. At Nicholas's request, the Brown Group jet was made immediately available, and by early Monday morning Father Harold was on his way back to Rome, arriving in time to be present on Monday evening, when the proclamation would be read from the balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square. And this ends chapter 10. Thanks for listening.